I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you came to be a concert pianist and how being a concert pianist led you to transit into being a systems philosopher. How did that work?
Well, I didn't intend to be a concert pianist. I mean, it was discovered that I have an aptitude or talent or whatever it is called for music. My mother was a concert pianist first and then a teacher, and I started working with me when I was 4 years old, and then she had to stop because she told me that afterwards that I thought I knew already everything. I didn't allow myself to be taught. But 6 months later she tried again, and then it got going, and so I have been considered a child prodigy and a concert pianist. That's my destination, that's my destiny. Nothing else would ever come into consideration. Once you are a musician, you're a professional musician, you are born into that, you don't do anything else. So that was chosen for me. I enjoyed music, of course, very much. As a child, I enjoyed the excitement of performing, but I was never thinking of it really seriously as a nothing but proposition. That's all I would be doing. But nothing seriously came up until in my late teens. I started thinking again about things that I heard as a child from my uncle, who was a philosopher, and that got me into inquiring into questions, what the relationship is between life and nature, between history and what we experience, because I went through the war experience in Hungary and recognized the tremendous changes that can occur in society, and asking questions about my own role and the role of art and music in particular in society. So these kind of questions that typically philosophers should be asking, and professional philosophers sometimes shun because they prefer to have the technicalities that they can manage. But these surfaced, and I started on my own with, in retrospect, appears to be an enormous amount of what we call self-confidence, chutzpah, I think we would call it now, but believing that I can address issues that great minds have addressed before and has not come to any satisfactory conclusion. I thought, well, I have to think about those things and see what I can come up with. Just confidence, or perhaps overconfidence, and it launched me into taking courses wherever I could, first in New York and then in Europe, and cultivating young people who were into those areas. So well, that's, again, it's a long story perhaps, but how did that lead me over? First of all, the experience of music is very liberating. When you are doing music, if you are doing it in a way that is satisfactory, that means everything works well, and you have to practice for that a lot. Then you can allow yourself to enjoy it, and then you grow wings, and all of a sudden you are up someplace, and you're no longer feeling the playing, moving your fingers, but you're up in another dynamic space. And then ideas seem to flow. You know, as long as you ask questions and you want to know things come together. And I used to have all through my concert life until I was in my early 30s, actually, all through the 20s. I used to have a typewriter very close to the piano, and I would practice, and then when I would sit down and say, now I can try and really perform and do the music that I would be then performing in public. And if I was well prepared, the piano at home was usually a good piano, then things would work well, and this particular feeling of almost a kind of ecstasy or a deep sense of liberation and freedom, then the ideas would come, and if I felt satisfied that I managed to get hold of some grasp, some concept that I was eluding me, that I tried to pull together, then I would sit down and try typing it up right away on the typewriter. And this is how my first books were born. It's on a little old Remington portable typewriter, which after a while the pages become so black that you couldn't see any more the writing on it. Then I would start and retype the whole thing from the beginning. I recognized that the computer can be a blessing in those conditions when you are formulating thoughts and you want to see it clear, and you can print it out again clear. But that's how it was. So I traveled with my notes, and because they were the only notes, there wasn't even copies in those days. You can make photocopies, photostatic copies in black and white in reverse, but only for documents. I never thought I'll make copies of my own writings on that. So I traveled with a batch of papers always with me, and one day after a concert, I was sitting after eating dinner, and after dinner I was looking at my notes again, and somebody joined me and asked what am I doing, and this person was at the concert. The concert turned out well, so I felt very expansive and started talking about my notes, which I seldom did because I felt people look very oddly at a concert pianist who all of a sudden starts talking about philosophy and science and so on. What does he want to do about those things? But here I felt good, and I talked about it a little bit, and he said, can you look at the notes? I said, yes. So I went back and finished my meal, and then the gentleman disappeared with my notes. I was concerned, but not all too concerned, because I knew, well, I still have in my head, and I can write them down again if necessary, but still I would have liked to see them back again. And next morning he showed up in the hotel where I was staying, and he said, well, we'll publish your notes. I said, well, how do you mean publish the notes? I never thought I'd write it for anybody. These were thoughts that I wanted to get clear for myself. And he turned out to be an editor for a major Dutch publishing house, an international publishing house called Martinus Nijhoff, and published philosophy and theology. And he said, you have to put a lot of work into making it presentable. The ideas are there, but you have to write it down in a way that we can publish. So I spent another year at this, and then it got published, and that was the first of many books, which eventually then took me to a career in the academic world, and from there to the UN, and from there to freelance and doing whatever I'm doing now. But what did that have to do with my thoughts? First of all, music enabled me to think, enabled me to be free to follow up intuitions, allow the things to flow, and then it helped me to concentrate on meaning, completeness of meaning, and not be satisfied with just to get one little piece of the puzzle. I wanted to see the picture that comes out of the puzzle. Since I wasn't a professional scientist or philosopher as I started, I never thought I'll make that a profession. I was thought of myself as a musician. So I didn't care about trying to bite down too big a chunk that I couldn't chew, but I just wanted to get to the bottom of things. I asked difficult questions, and so I look for the wholeness, because in music you are always dealing with a completed work. And a really great piece of music is a combination of individual sounds with different frequencies, with rhythm and with dynamics and with harmonies. And the individual sound in itself doesn't have any meaning. It's the relationship between them all that counts. And you can't take away or add to a piece of music without changing the whole thing. In a masterpiece such as Mozart and Beethoven or Schubert, you try to change any one chord in it, and right away the whole thing becomes damaged, as it were. I mean, it just has to stand the way it is. And later on I found that this is very much how complex systems are. Certain living systems are like that. You can't substitute parts in them, you can't change them, you can't try to improve on them. If they are healthy, if they work well, then they are a complete whole. So I was looking for this kind of complete wholes and asking myself, how come that they arise in nature? How can they arise, such complex things? And how from simpler beginnings in the world, and how am I related to them, and how is society related to them. So these are the questions that occurred to me as I was beginning this career of inquiry.
Did you encounter resistance or opposition or dubiety from people who were specialized in one or another discipline and who kind of may have resented your being such a generalist? Did you encounter any of that sort of thing?
Frequently. This is territoriality is very pronounced in the academic world, and you don't get people except on the very top. Young people perhaps, and on the very top. You have people who will be free or be happy to try to help you by speculating, by thinking what it is that they are doing. The rest are academic specialists, often technicians, often career-minded people, and they just want to see that they pursue their own particular specialties, and other people should not be concerned about it, and certainly not put their foot into it, because they are not likely to be able to know as much about it as they do. And the specialist, knows a great deal about very little. And they always say that a generalist will know very little about a great deal, but they don't want to have the Indian territory anybody coming in who knows very little about it. So how to be a generalist of the kind who knows the elementary essential factors about many different things. And you have to be able to filter things out. Filter out the techniques, filter out the controversies, and ask what is really essential. And sometimes you find it in a major work in one page or in a couple of paragraphs, usually in conclusions, usually by people who dare to speculate on what it all means. And the rest is technique, the rest is criticism of prior work and trying to show that you know better.
Well, I know that you were influenced by Whitehead and that you worked with Ludwig von Bartholanthy to originate what's now called general systems theory. Can you kind of talk about the link between those two thinkers and how you came to work with Bartholanthy?
Well, Whitehead was my first love in terms of systematic philosophy. Since the questions that I asked were embracing questions and I want to know about relationships, I soon realized that I'm looking for something that shows how an individual or a society or a whole biosphere perhaps can be considered a single system. I didn't know it called a system at the time, but I recognized that Whitehead developed what he called the organic metaphysics. And process and reality in his main work, process is more important, was always to my mind, than identifying things the way they are, because things are not static, things move. And so these things grow and develop and vanish and get reborn and resurface, etc. Nothing is the same way as it was before at any given time. So Whitehead gave me a great deal of satisfaction. Again, with that confidence of a very young man, I decided to study Whitehead very carefully, and went through it bit by bit and tried to ask myself, what does that tell us about the questions that I want to ask? And I came across this notion that whatever there is, what we can call reality, is something that's coming together in the course of time. It begins to act as a whole, and it gets to further evolve, comes together with other things, again forms another whole. And I published several books on this, 3 books to be exact, in the early period, from 63 to 66. In 66, all of a sudden I got an invitation out of the blue from Yale University. Some people there in the philosophy department read these books and said, would I come and spend a year as a research fellow and giving a seminar and carrying on the kind of research I want to do, have access to the faculty and access to any of the offerings of the department. I went to Yale, and there I met among others, a very remarkable philosopher of science called Hansen, who killed himself very shortly after that because his hobby was to fly planes, and he flew World War II Spitfires or whatever those planes were called, and he tried always to buzz his friends. At one point he just crashed with it. But he was a very bright man, a very inquiring man, and he developed similar ideas. And when I told him about my problems, he says, "Well, there's something that coagulates in course of time. Why don't you just call it coagula?" So I thought about this for a while. In fact, I tried writing out my later become my first major work in terms of coagula, but I'd never really liked the terms. And then some of the students said, "But do you know, there's this man who developed systems theory, calls it a general systems. Maybe what you're talking about is a kind of a system." So I found out where this man lives. He was living in Canada at the time. Then he moved shortly after that to the state of New York. I got in touch with him, I met him, and we started a collaboration. And this was Ludwig von Bertalanffy, an Austrian biologist who dared to go beyond the range of his, or the territory of his discipline, and say that a system is not just a living system. Anything can be a system. It's an organization, a society, a cellular colony, whatever is a system. And he was duly criticized and excommunicated by many of his colleagues, but he persisted. I met him, I met Paul Weiss, another biologist at Rockefeller University at the time. They both wrote their dissertations in Vienna, and I think Weiss's dissertation was called "The Butterfly Considered as a System," and von Bertalanffy wrote on some very special problem and physiology, and looking at it as part of the organism as a system. So these were pioneers, and they had a great influence on me, and I tried to develop an overarching theory. I was always looking for the meaning in the whole at that time, which von Bertalanffy suggested, well, this is a systems theory, but it goes beyond on the next level, so why don't you call it a systems philosophy? So this became my major book on that, was modestly titled An Introduction to Systems Philosophy, with an introduction to it, a foreword by Ludwig von Bertalanffy. And that then launched me on the explorations that I continue to this day.
Did you have much contact with Arthur Koestler during those times? I know he was...
Von Bertalanffy had contact with Koestler, and they had these seminars in Austria, and I remember reading about them. I never actually met Koestler. He died before I was living in America at the time, and before I really settled or moved back to Europe. He wasn't around anymore. But I read, particularly with great attention, it had a great influence on me, a book I think he called Beyond Reductionism.
Yes.
And this was a series of contributions by like-minded people who were at the beginning of the systems movement. And I thought this is very insightful, and to this day I think it's absolutely should be one of the Bibles of the new thinking that we need.
Another person that I wanted to ask you about, who's, well, Janisch, is that the way you pronounce it?
Janisch,
yeah. And his idea of autopoiesis and that whole, what contributions you saw him making in his work.
Well, Janisch was a good friend. Actually, by the way, autopoiesis was originally thought out by Maturana, who was a biologist.
Right,
but Janisch picked up the notion, and the notion of evolution, worked with Waddington, a great biologist and ecologist. With Erich Janisch, I had a great deal of affinity because he was professionally a music critic. That was his work. And he moved into academia the same way I did, out of a personal interest from music. Only from the other side, I mean, I would play the concert and he would write a review of it next day, you see. He actually never reviewed my concerts, we never got together in that way. But when we met at meetings, brought together by Van Bertalanffy actually, we immediately found a great deal of empathy. And I remember sitting in a hotel room in Tokyo at a meeting of a systems science meeting in Tokyo in the very early 70s, I think. And Jantsch just gave me his book, and he asked me to read, to have a look at it. And he gave it to me in the evening after the evening session. And next morning I called him. I said, I've just finished reading it. I didn't sleep that night. I read through the whole thing. And we sat down again for breakfast. And I had, with all due modesty, I had suggested a title, and that's the title he adopted. That's the title under which it was published. Now, you must, in a way, prompt me. I can't think of the title at the present time. But Design for Evolution. That was the title. Yes.
Yeah. Are there other people that you worked with that you would like to remember in this kind of a brief autobiography, intellectual autobiography?
Well, many people. Prigozhin among them. Ilya Prigozhin, who even as a relatively young man came across these ideas that Jantsch told me about. And Jantsch said, you absolutely have to meet Prigozhin, you have to read him. I was very impressed because his exposition was heavily demonstrated in mathematics, so it seemed very complex. But I met Prigozhin. We had a number of times when we were sitting together and made excursions into nature, and he was just talking freely about his ideas. And this whole idea of a bifurcation and of a dissipative system, an open system, all these things that I started to work on with Van Bertalanffy. Prigozhin could show how these things works and how it works out, even on the chemical or biochemical level, physical chemical level even, and he could show basic relationships which then earned him in 1977 the Nobel Prize. But he always felt that he is an oddball in a way. He's always way out, of others. He was always heavily criticized. He actually got the Nobel Prize. It doesn't take anything away from him because I think it was absolutely the right choice, but he got it more or less by accident because the jury couldn't agree on two other people, and he was there the third as a dark horse candidate. And so he was more surprised, Prigozhin himself, with the news than anybody else. But it was a marvelous thing because it gave a tremendous push to the legitimacy of this notion of evolution, of evolving complex systems. And we had many times been working together. The last time it was at the Spoleto in Italy, at the Two Worlds Festival. Menotti was one of the people behind it. And this Two Worlds Festival was music, art, as well as a science part to it. A Two Worlds Science Symposium or so. And on the form of that, in the framework of that, at one point, a very popular anchorman in Italy ran a program where he asked Prigozhin and myself about what we thought, what our ideas were. And I went through trying to answer the questions. And remember, Prigozhin was coming on then the air, and the anchorman asked him, Professor Prigozhin, what are you working on now? And Prigozhin talked non-stop for 25 minutes, so that was the end of the program. He never got any other question. And I asked him afterwards, why don't you let him ask you questions? He said, well, I'm not at all sure that those are questions that will be friendly or I can answer. You asked me what I'm interested in. I told him what I'm interested in, what I'm working on. But he was always defensive. It's truly, when you are coming out, even if you are at that time was Nobel laureate, you still had the feeling that all those people working on the little bits and pieces and the very specialties looking at you and you not taking you seriously. So that's a prize one has to take. But I was never considered myself a professional philosopher or a professional anything, actually. I don't like to consider myself a professional pianist either, although I was making my living on that for a long time. And then afterwards in academic life, of course, I'm making a living as a professor, but I don't like the whole idea of professionalism. I think I like to go where I want to go, and if people don't want to follow me, it's okay. As long as I think it's interesting to go there, I want to get there.
Well, it would be absurd, really, for me to ask you to summarize your work. Are there a few key concepts that you think are really important, looking back now, as you kind of are able to distill the essence of the conclusions you've come to?
Well, one of the key concepts is that the world is not built either as a mechanism or as a layer cake. I mean, it's not a mechanism that you can take apart, you can manipulate. It's a highly integrated thing. It's more like a living system. And it's not a layer cake in the sense that there isn't just a physical strata and then a separate biological or living strata and then a cultural one, or even perhaps afterwards a spiritual one. My conviction is that it's all a single, enormously complex but extremely harmonious dynamic system, of which has these many aspects, many different levels at which you can ask questions. You can enter into a dialogue and you get the kind of answers depending on the questions you ask. But it's a self-evolving system, and the whole cosmos is basically a highly intelligent, goal-directed, but not mechanically goal-directed, but overall goal-directed kind of a system where it just moves toward complexity, moves toward harmony, moves toward relationships, wherever and however it can find it. So it is not a single kind of goal built into it from advance, but it just makes use of whatever is possible, whatever energy is possible, whatever information is available. It makes use to develop into these more and more complex systems. And at the same time, this is the last thing perhaps I should add on to this, or the third basic notion, is that it also has an aspect of mind. Mind and consciousness is always part of the system. It's not something outside of it. I'm very strongly against the view that consciousness emerges at a given point, like a complex system, like a brain, all of a sudden it starts producing consciousness. I think consciousness was there at all points. A complex system manifests consciousness in a more complex way. You need a complex system to be able to bring out the potentials of what is consciousness, which is there in the cosmos. To make it visible, to elaborate it, to make it workable. But the consciousness is there in the cosmos, was there from the very beginning, and it's evolving in the course of time in association with matter energy. I mean, energy is of course more substantial, more essential than matter, but what we call matter is a kind of a condensed form of, or stationary form of energy. And so I would add that the insight is this, that consciousness is universal. And we as a human species are in a privileged position that at least in this part of this galaxy, we seem to be a species that has a high ability to manifest consciousness, because we have reached a highly complex form of biological organization, which is reflected in our brain and nervous system. And that enables us to reach a kind of level of consciousness which can recognize itself and can recognize the world, so not only exist in the world and perceive the world, but know something about itself and the world, which is expressed in the great quest of the oracle at Delphi, which said, know thyself is the greatest mission. So that enables us to attempt to know ourselves. It's not a task we can finish, but we can always ask and try. And this is a responsibility. If we have this, we have to try to use it so as to preserve this ability and to further to evolve it, to reach higher and higher levels of consciousness, maintain the species in which is our species, and not destroy itself, not destroy its environment, but help this planet to give rise to more and more complex forms of life and more complex forms of mind and consciousness.
Now, you've drawn together insights and discoveries and models from a whole range of disciplines and fields. And you've seen kind of the currency of the view that you've pioneered begin to take hold in the culture. To what extent do you see this as a real paradigm change, as could call it a societal-wide change of point of view? Do you think that's happening, or is there still too much resistance to what you're
It's in the process of happening. Increasingly, I find that the ideas that I have come up with decades ago are becoming rediscovered, and of course, often discovered as something new. And I'm reminded by Gandhi's sayings that said that, well, if you come up with something new, innovation, first you're ignored, then you're attacked, and then finally you may be accepted with the proviso that people say, well, we have known that all along. And so the latter one is beginning to happen, but the attack is to some extent continues. I'm less ignored than I was before, I should put it that way.
Well, what would you say are the real-world applications of this? You've written a book called The Chaos Point, and so I'm sure you think about all the time the very danger of our, as a species, kind of committing default suicide. What are the real-world applications of the point of view that you have that could get in the way of our destructive tendencies?
The recognition, first of all, that what is happening to us is neither temporary nor reversible, nor is it haphazard, purely accidental. It's part of the dynamic, part of the logic of development. You recognize that a complex system cannot keep developing the same way indefinitely. It's an open system because you can't otherwise gain in complexity unless you constantly pick up energy and information from your environment, that we know from thermodynamics. So we're dealing with open systems, and these open systems will have to maintain themselves by compensating using up the energy and the information. It's the whole notion of entropy. By bringing in fresh energy and information from the environment. This process continues until the system learns to store and to utilize more and more of this energy and information, but that calls for changes in the structure. It reaches a point in which these changes are no longer smooth, gradual changes, but they are becoming sudden changes, tipping points. And this is why many complex systems, a great overwhelming majority of living systems since the Cambrian 6-7 million years ago, have become extinct. Because evolution is not forgiving. You have to be able to come up with a more viable system when you are threatened as a current system. And so what's happening to humanity is not necessarily moving to an extinction, but we are moving on the point where we could become extinct. We have one great advantage over most other species, practically all the species, that we can recognize this process. And we can find out what it is, find out that we are at this point, and not only ask ourselves what to do, but then actively try to look for and adopt ways of coping with it, so that we can re-evolve ourselves. It's not a question of evolving ourselves physiologically, because we can't change our genotype, although we can engineer now to some extent the genetic information, but we can't make another species. We can't even make the simplest kind of species, much less kind of redo a human being. But our problems are not with our genotype, and not with our phenotype as an individual. Our problems are cultural problems, social problems, civilizational problems. And that means that the coding, if I use that word, is not genetic, it's cultural, it's conceptual, it's our worldview, it's our values, and those things that we have got to change. Our worldview dictates how we act, how we orient ourselves in the world, dictates our values, dictates then our behaviors or priorities. It sets these priorities for us, And if you're setting the wrong kind of priorities, which could perhaps work very well in the short term for us or a small group of people, but in the long term and for larger groups of people, it has negative effects or negative effect on the environment as well. If that is what we are doing, then we have to change. And we have undergone evolution, which is a cultural evolution, not a biological evolution. And this is the challenge before us, to evolve ourselves as a cultural species, because if we fail to do that, we're going to become extinct, biologically extinct, because we're destroying our environment and therefore destroying the very basis of our life. So there it is, to recognize this, that there is a point of this tipping point. It's called a bifurcation point, or more popularly I call it a chaos point, where there is the choice before us is similar to that of a bicycle rider. Somebody who goes on a bicycle and goes uphill and finds that it's getting heavier and heavier to pedal. After a while his energy seems to be running out and you can't keep going forward again, you can't go backwards with a bicycle, so he has to find another way. If you don't find another way, you're going to fall off. And it's as simple as that. In a bifurcation point, you either manage to move forward by finding a different path for your evolution, or you disappear. You dissolve, so to speak, or disaggregate to your stable component, which is what happens when an individual dies biologically. A society can disaggregate to small family components, to small tribes, etc. as well. Then its culture has been demolished, basically. If you try to do that today with the kind of tremendous powerful technologies we have at our disposal, we might very well kill ourselves off in the process. So we can't allow these systems to simply get demolished. We have to evolve them into a higher level of cooperation and at a higher level of synchronization, syntropy if you like, or synchronization. And that's the challenge. It's possible to meet this challenge, but the precondition is to recognize that it's there, to recognize that it has a logic of its own. You have to interact with the system, just as if you can interact with a computer. In some way. You don't just go around with a hammer trying to fix it in some way. You can interact with it logically. Our human systems are, in that way, dynamic systems that require us to cope with a good deal of understanding and insight.
Mei Wang Ho has talked about this concept of syntropy or negentropy. Can you talk a little bit about how this tendency to self-transcend in systems relates to the second law of thermodynamics and the whole idea that things inevitably run down? It seems like evolution is going counter to this tendency.
Well, the idea that there are two basic directions in evolution goes back to the 19th century. People like Boltzmann and Bergson were very much struck with this problem. They wrote many brilliant things about it, having somehow, according to Henri Bergson's terms, an élan vital, a vital impulse that moves you against the stream. It's like salmon swimming upstream. I don't think that there is a contradiction between the two kinds of things, as running down and running up or winding up, because running down is this very special case of a universal tendency, and it applies to closed systems. Closed systems which are closed off from their environment in such a way that there is no matter, energy or information can penetrate their boundaries. If you have a system like that, then sooner or later, of course, it uses up its free energy, it runs down and becomes inert. But there are no closed systems in the world. It's not really a description of the real world. It's an idealization. It was considered that the universe is a closed system, because where else would it get energy and information from? But now we know that the manifest universe actually is based on a virtual energy field, which I consider is also an information field, which is constantly feeding in fresh energy and feeding in information. So that nothing in the world is a closed system. Nothing in the world runs down. I don't think the universe is running down. I think the universe is evolving, is structuring itself, and it's generating information, and it's conserving the information, can build on that information.
Is there an element of teleology in this? Is that what you're suggesting? Or is it a learning universe, kind of? Just making it up as it goes along?
It's not teleology, it's teleonomy, and the distinction is just that you are generating the direction. It's not pre-given. It's an example that was given by John Wheeler that I find very insightful. It's based on the very familiar parlor game of 20 questions, where somebody goes out and somebody else goes out, and the rest of the people think of something, and then the person can ask various questions, like, for example, is it animal or mineral, and so on. You can only answer yes or no, but there's a precondition. Your answers have to be consistent with one another, of course. So that there is a special variant of this where the person goes out and the others conspire to pretend that they thought of something, but they haven't thought of anything. But they will give an answer, always yes or no, and their answers have to be consistent. Each answer has to be consistent. And a skilled interlocutor can, within 20 questions, easily come up with an answer, the goal. It was the lamppost next door, or the cat of the neighbor's cat, or whatever that you were thinking of. And why? Because consistency. Once you say it's animal rather than mineral, then you are limited to the animal domain. Once you say it's a feline, then you're limited to the cats, etc., etc. So consistency in a game or any kind of an open system can move toward a favored ending or result. It generates its own goal. Wheeler actually offered this not as an example of evolution, but as an example of quantum processes, which seem to also to move into their own direction without any mechanical impulse given to them. But it's a general case, so I don't believe goals are given, God-given or whatever given. Goals are being generated. Why? Because the system is consistent and has a certain potential. In that sense, there is some amount of directionality preconceived there, that this universe system appears to search for complexity, search for harmony, for integration, search for the use of the available energy and information. Why don't we have just inert gases in this universe? Why do we have stars and planetary systems? Once you have this planetary system on Earth, why don't we just have the simplest kind of algae in it? Why do we have more complex systems? The algae is a very good organism. It can survive under most of the conditions that we have on the planet Earth. Why did they have to look for oxygen in the atmosphere to move beyond that first stage and create this more complex systems with the enclosed nucleus of the cell? So there is something, yes, definitely, which seems to be a preferred direction, not a pre-given goal, but a direction of development. And human society itself moves toward it in the same direction, from simple, relatively simple societies with very clear-cut division of labor. The men go out hunting or gathering food, the women tend the home fires, so to speak, and take care of children. In one version or another, simple tribal societies are very stable and have a very clear-cut ability to survive. Why do we go beyond that? Why did we go beyond that and move always to more complex societies, less and less stable? As we go to a complexity, we become less stable, more able to react, at the same time more endangered by outside influences. A human being can be flattened not only by a stone, by a brick falling from the second floor someplace, but also by a common flu, if it's a bad variety. A simple organism is much more stable than that. A cell can divide and divide, and it has no really end to its existence. Sharks have survived for millions of years unchanged, basically. They are very good organisms, but evolution doesn't stop. It moves on toward higher levels of integration, higher levels of organization, greater and greater sensitivity, and we are at the vanguard of that particular movement as a human species.
So, did you?
Yeah, I was wondering if we could talk about intentionality and the power of common intent right now at this point to affect the direction.
And maybe in the context of the Akashic field, I don't know if that relates.
I think everything relates to it. But the intention, or the power of intentionality, raises the question of whether consciousness can be a physically effective factor, or I don't even know what the alternative to that is, but which is purely an ideal thing that happens in your head and doesn't affect anything else. But if you look at consciousness as an instrumentation, as an instrument whereby you are reading information in the cosmos, in the world around you, it's the biosphere, or obviously it's not the whole cosmos immediately, but what there is given already. And so not limited to going to libraries and opening books or going to the internet and opening up a website, but you can also intuit information. Then your consciousness becomes a powerful factor in your own development. And the same way, then, if you can pick up information from others, it stands to reason that you yourself can give information. You yourself can affect others. And that's the power of consciousness, that we can read ourselves into this information field just as simply as we can read out others from this information field. I think this is a holographic process, but that's perhaps another more technical problem. But the factor seems to me that if your consciousness can affect the field, then whatever you project through your consciousness will also affect that field. There are many provisos for this, because it does seem, and some experiments show, that too much intentionality, too much directedness can actually bias the results and do not always lead to the desired results. But anyway, has to allow a level of spontaneity, which the Easterners, the Orientals, have understood this very well when they talk about emptying your mind, not having a sense of the ego and what your ego wants to do. So this entering into the field with this kind of an openness, with an open mind, I think has a greater effect than entering on it and saying, now I want to do something, to it. And this, I think, the power of intentionality lies there. We know the power of meditation and prayer to heal, and it can be used for good or for bad. In voodoo, sometimes has been used to inflict harm. But today, those people discovered this, I think, are more intent on healing than on using it negatively. At least I hope so.
So you have traveled the world now for some years, spreading the word, as it were. What do you see as your kind of social-cultural goal, and what are some of the organizations that you have formed or are in relationship with?
Well, I was a part of the Club of Rome from the beginning, which is a think tank that in 1972 we published this report, The Limits to Growth, which made an impact at the time, although it was generally dismissed by the business community, saying, wow, this is just a computer projection, and they were saying garbage in, garbage out. If you don't know exactly what you're putting in, you can't depend on what's coming out of it. But the idea got hold of, I think, of the leading circles of altogether of the mind of mankind, you could say, that there are limits to growth. You just can't keep going forever with the same kind of growth processes. As sooner or later it becomes cancerous. So now then I founded the Club of Budapest, which differs from the Club of Rome in that we decided not to just to address ourselves to decision makers in politics and business, but go to civil society, talk to people, and try to use the power of art and spirituality as well to bring about a change in consciousness. basically changing consciousness, not just looking for strategies of better sources of energy, important as it may be, or better politics or better business strategy, but to use the power of consciousness to change people's priorities, values and behaviors. That's the basis of it. And my ambition is to make the Club of Budapest superfluous, and then we'll close it down. We said at the very beginning of the Club of Rome also that what we no longer needed, and we'll close it down. It hasn't been closed down, although it has, I think, survived to some extent its usefulness. But the Club of Budapest, for the time being, is still very useful. It should be useful. It's more useful than it's actually, as the role that it actually plays, because it's not recognized sufficiently as how useful it could be. But my goal would be, which I don't think I'll reach in this lifetime, of reaching a point where an organization like the Club of Budapest is no longer needed, because the consciousness change has occurred and people have managed to create a civilization which has diversity, but which has unity and which is peaceful and sustainable.
So what gives you hope that that can, in fact, will occur?
I don't have a conviction that it will occur. I have a hope that it may occur, because the human experiment with this high level of consciousness is so precious that if it came this far, I mean, to let it go, fall by the wayside out of stupidity, out of short-sightedness, seems to be such a cosmic waste. So there is, I think there may be powers. Sometimes I hope, I tend to suspect that there are higher forces being concerned about our fate and helping us to develop this kind of a new civilization that we so desperately need. There is definitely a kind of a spiritual reawakening in the world, as a renaissance of some kind. There is what the French would call a prise de conscience, somehow awakening of one's consciousness. Whether it comes in time, I don't know, but it is happening, and the human system is reacting to the dangers. What gives me hope is that this system has a great deal of autonomy, a great deal of resilience, and it is able to, in some sense, like an organism, produce an antibody to the toxins. Toxins is old-fashioned behavior, and the antibodies would be a wiser form of behavior, you know, wiser ideas. So that gives me hope that this may be the case, that the human system, the human species, is a self-organizing, self-evolving species that is able to surmount the crisis.
Is there anything we...
Could you just mention some of the projects that you're involved with around the world with that are galvanizing and helping to evoke that kind of response?
Well, the projects I'm involved with and working through the Club of Budapest in partnership with many other organizations all center on encouraging this transformation of consciousness toward a more sustainable civilization. There are various levels. We have operated for long with the idea that we have some key individuals who will come out and state the importance of this kind of change, and therefore will help others to move in that direction, and we're giving prizes to these individuals. We had Bishop Tutu and Shimon Peres and Nelson Mandela and Gorbachev and Havel and so on. They were received planetary consciousness prizes in the framework of a celebration that we hope to get to the press and to make people understand why these people received this prize. Then we have tried to do surveys of the kind of culture that is emerging, seemingly on the margins, but is moving more and more into the mainstream. Some of these are called the cultural creatives, kind of a subculture that is living more responsibly and sustainably. It doesn't have the weight that it should have, the political and the economic weight, because people don't know how many people are and how determined are they to live differently. Yet the people I tend to talk to are all cultural creatives of one kind or another, and in a way I can be accused of preaching to the converted. But this is certainly one kind of project. And lately we have been involved also in the educational level of trying to create a way in which people who want to gather knowledge, inform themselves, and skills as well in this direction, can in the process also acquire an academic credential. So we are, if all goes well, by the end of this year, we'll have an operation, something called the World Shift University, which will give a master's degree in sustainable transformation. Transformation that is required, but it has to be sustainable in itself and move toward a sustainable world. Last but not least, I should mention a project which attempts to demonstrate or to make clear to people that consciousness does affect conditions, and we bring together people to meditate on a peaceful and sustainable world. And this started relatively modestly, although the first impulse was already quite ambitious. It was in Japan. The Goei Peace Foundation decided to hold a meditation event for 10,000 people at the bottom of Mount Fuji, their sacred site. And when I heard about this, I suggested that let's join this with other events. Maybe other people would like to join elsewhere, you know. And then let's see what effect it does have. And I suggested it first to spiritual people I know in India, and they happily embraced the idea. To make a longer story short, it now turns out that we have upwards of 150,000 people involved in one day in a protocoled and hopefully disciplined way, getting together. Whatever they do before or after, it will be their business, but for half an hour meditate together at an exactly chronographed, synchronized way at a time in different parts of the world, and for 5 minutes they will hold hands around the representation of the earth and send healing energies. At the very least, we hope to show is that this has an effect on crime rates, on suicide rates, on accident rates in the area. Possibly it has an effect on computers that are so sensitive that even very small, apparently even consciousness changes can influence it. These are random number generated computers that have been operating out of Princeton for quite a while now, and we're going to monitor that as well. So that's an experiment. Last but not least, I want to say, oh, by the way, this experiment is to take place on the 20th of May in 2007.
And can people participate?
People are most welcome to participate, and we're asking people to join wherever they are. If they can come together in groups of a little larger group of, let's say, 500 people or more, then to let us know, and then we'll register it and we'll have them monitored. They don't know that they have nothing to do with the monitoring, but we see if there's an effect, as I said, of social indicators and on computers, elsewhere on the computers worldwide.
And where would they go to join? Is there a website?
They would look at the website, which has this sort of complete name of Global Peace Meditation Prayer Day, in one word, .org. And we hope that this 150,000 will grow. Some people claim that we'll reach 500,000. I don't know yet. We have 1 more month to go at this particular moment. And then, last but not least, I should mention that we are hoping to bring together at high-level meetings, at one meeting, the spiritual leaders of various religions and spiritual movements in Bangalore. And this was to take place this June 5th and 6th. And at another meeting, try to get together opinion leaders and political leaders, but mostly not active politicians, but former politicians who are freer to act and to try to come forth with their own views, hopefully beneficial views, without running into political difficulties as a result. And my hope for that latter meeting is that these political leaders will endorse creating an organization that I provisionally call the Endangered Populations Survival Security Council. Again, I can't find a shorter term for this, but the idea should be very clear. As climate change is occurring, as poverty is deepening and marginalization is increasing, all these are threatening the poorest populations in many parts of the world, especially those who are exposed to drought and to flooding, and as well as to lack of water, safe water. And there could be hundreds of millions of people really seriously threatened already in the next 4 to 5 years. And there's no special provision made for these. So I'm suggesting to create an organization, which we have been offered a headquarters building already in Geneva with the staff to do this, to monitor the situation and call attention to what is happening, what the threats are, what the time frames may be, and to try to mobilize the funds and the intellectual capital to come to the aid of these populations.
Who are you doing that in partnership?
Again, what that's called?
Well, we are doing the Spiritual Summit and the Political Summit in partnership with the Art of Living Foundation. In fact, the meetings themselves will be hosted by the Art of Living Foundation, headed by a very remarkable spiritual leader called Sri Sri Ravi Shankar. He's the only spiritual leader who is routinely and normally given the honorary name of Sri Sri, not just one Sri, and is also known as His Holiness, as the same as the Dalai Lama. What does he want to do about those things? But here I felt good, and I talked about it a little bit, and he said, "Can you look at the notes?" I said, "Yes." So I went back and finished my meal, and then the gentleman disappeared with my notes. I was concerned, but not all too concerned, because I knew, well, I still have in my head, and I can write them down again if necessary, but still I would have liked to see them back again. And next morning he showed up in the hotel where I was staying, and he said, "Well, we'll publish your notes." I said, "Well, how do you mean publish the notes?" I never thought I'd write it for anybody. These were thoughts that I wanted to get clear for myself. And he turned out to be an editor for a major Dutch publishing house, an international publishing house called Martinus Nijhoff, and published philosophy and theology. And he said, you have to put a lot of work into making it presentable. The ideas are there, but you have to write it down in a way that we can publish. So I spent another year at this, and then it got published, and that was the first of many books, which eventually then took me to a career in the academic world, and from there to the UN, and from there to freelance and doing whatever I'm doing now. But what did that have to do with my thoughts? First of all, music enabled me to think, enabled me to be free to follow up intuitions, allow the things to flow, and then it helped me to concentrate on meaning, completeness of meaning, and not be satisfied with just to get one little piece of the puzzle. I wanted to see the picture that comes out of the puzzle. Since I wasn't a professional scientist or philosopher as I started, I was never thought I'll make that a profession. I was thought of myself as a musician. So I didn't care about trying to bite down too big a chunk that I couldn't chew, but I just wanted to get
I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you came to be a concert pianist, and how being a concert pianist led you to transit into being a systems philosopher. How did that work?
Well, I didn't intend to be a concert pianist. I mean, it was discovered that I have an aptitude or talent or whatever it is called for music. My mother was a concert pianist first, and then a teacher. And I started working with me when I was 4 years old, and then she had to stop because she told me that afterwards that I thought I knew already everything. I didn't allow myself to be taught. But 6 months later she tried again, and then it got going. And so I have been considered a child prodigy and a concert pianist. That's my destination, that's my destiny. Nothing else would ever come into consideration. Once you are a musician, you're a professional musician, you are born into that, you don't do anything else. So that was chosen for me. I enjoyed music, of course, very much. As a child, I enjoyed the excitement of performing, but I was never thinking of it really seriously as a nothing but proposition. That's all I would be doing. But nothing seriously came up until in my late teens. I started thinking again about things that I heard as a child from my uncle, who was a philosopher, and that got me into inquiring into questions. What the relationship is between life and nature, between history and what we experience, because I went through the war experience in Hungary, and recognize now I can try and really perform and do the music that I would be then performing in public. And if I was well prepared, if the piano at home was usually a good piano, then things would work well, and this particular feeling of almost a kind of ecstasy or a deep sense of liberation and freedom, then the ideas would come, and if I felt satisfied that it's I managed to get hold of some grasp, some concept that I was eluding me, that I tried to pull together, then I would sit down and try typing it up right away on the typewriter. And this is how my first books were born, on a little old Remington portable typewriter, which after a while the pages become so black that you couldn't see any more the writing on it. Then I would start and retype the whole thing from the beginning. I recognized that the computer can be a blessing in those conditions when you are formulating thoughts and you want to see it clear, and you can print it out again clear. But that's how it was. So I traveled with my notes, and because they were the only notes, there wasn't even copies in those days. You can make photocopies, photostatic copies in black and white in reverse, but only for documents. I never thought I'll make copies of my own writings on that. So I traveled with a batch of papers always with me, and one day after a concert, I was sitting after eating dinner, and after dinner I was looking at my notes again, and somebody joined me and asked what am I doing, and this person was at the concert. The concert turned out well, so I felt very expansive and started talking about my notes, which I seldom did because I felt people look very oddly at a concert pianist who all of a sudden starts talking about philosophy and science. And to the bottom of things, I asked difficult questions, and so I look for the wholeness, because in music you are always dealing with a completed work. And a really great piece of music is a combination of individual sounds with different frequencies, with rhythm and with dynamics and with harmonies. And the individual sound in itself doesn't have any meaning. It's the relationship between them all that counts. And you can't take away or add to a piece of music without changing the whole thing. In a masterpiece such as Mozart and Beethoven or Schubert, you try to change any one chord in it, and right away the whole thing becomes damaged, as it were. I mean, it just has to stand the way it is. And later on I found that this is very much how complex systems are. Certain living systems are like that. You can't substitute parts in them, you can't change them, you can't try to improve on them. If they are healthy, if they work well, then they are a complete whole. So I was looking for this kind of complete wholes and asking myself, how come that they arise in nature? How can they arise, such complex things, and how from simpler beginnings in the world? And how am I related to them, and how is society related to them? So these are the questions that occurred to me as I was beginning this career of inquiry.
Did you encounter resistance or opposition or dubiety from people who were specialized in one or another discipline and who kind of may have resented your being such a generalist? Did you encounter any of that sort of thing?
Frequently. This is territoriality is very pronounced in the academic world, and you don't get people except on the very top. Young people perhaps, and on the very top. You have the tremendous changes that can occur in society. And asking questions about my own role and the role of art and music in particular in society. So this kind of questions that typically philosophers should be asking, and professional philosophers sometimes shun because they prefer to have the technicalities that they can manage. But these surfaced, and I started on my own with, in retrospect, appears to be an enormous amount of what we call self-confidence, chutzpah, I think we would call it now, but believing that I can address issues that great minds have addressed before and have not come to any satisfactory conclusion. I thought, well, I have to think about those things and see what I can come up with. Just confidence, or perhaps overconfidence, and it launched me into taking courses wherever I could, first in New York and then in Europe, and cultivating young people who were into those areas. So well, that's, again, it's a long story perhaps, but how did that lead me over? First of all, the experience of music is very liberating. When you are doing music, if you are doing it in a way that is satisfactory, that means everything works well, and you have to practice for that a lot. Then you can allow yourself to enjoy it, and then you grow wings, and all of a sudden you are up someplace, and you are no longer feeling the playing, moving your fingers, but you're up in another dynamic space. And then ideas seem to flow, you know. As long as you ask questions and you want to know things come together. And I used to have all through my concert life until I was in my early 30s, actually, all through the 20s. I used to have a typewriter very close to the piano, and I would practice, and then when I would sit down and say